All right, welcome back to Moon Lodge Mingle, my second episode. My name is B. La Rosa, and I am the owner of Moon Lodge Mystic. I am a depth worker that uses tarot and Vedic astrology to help people do their shadow work, essentially, which is going to be today's topic. I'm going to be giving an overview of what shadow work is. This is the bread and butter of the work that I do, both in my personal spiritual journey and as an intuitive and spiritual professional. Now, I came to shadow work through my own personal interest in Jungian psychology. I did not come to it through social media like a lot of people have. A lot of my customers who get readings from me, I can tell they've encountered these topics mostly through social media. That's the main vector into it. But honestly, there's a lot of important theoretical context that is missing from the social media presentation of shadow work. So I'm here to give an organic kind of presentation of what that all is. So the first thing to know about shadow work is that we are working within a theoretical framework that was put forth by Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychoanalyst, and his work, Jungian psychoanalysis, and his theoretical work around archetypes and shadow integration and things like that, and projection, that had a fundamental, monumental influence on Western occultism and mysticism, New Age spirituality. So if you're coming into metaphysics or witchcraft and things like that, it's really helpful to get some background information on Carl Jung and his theory of psychoanalysis. Frankly, it influences nearly every layer of New Age spirituality. So let's start with Carl Jung's model of the psyche. One of my favorite ways of describing this is by using Joseph Campbell's lecture on shadow, and he drew a really great chart that kind of just demonstrated the model in a really approachable way. Now, I want you to imagine in your mind's eye, there is a circle, and this circle has a horizontal line drawn through it. And that line, it doesn't go through the center of the circle. It goes a little bit through maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of the way in the circle. Now, this line represents the threshold of awareness that we experience in our experience of consciousness in our mental activity. Everything within the circle, we're going to call psychic contents. This is contents or material that exists within the totality of your psyche. Your psyche represents your conscious awareness, your unconscious, your subconscious, your memories, your drives and instincts, autonomic bodily processes like your brain stem, the reptilian brain. All of that is contained within the psyche and interacts with itself in a holistic way. And everything below the horizontal line in this circle is stuff that's unconscious to us. It's things that we're not always directly aware of, that we don't have direct conscious relationship or control over. Things like your heartbeat, your digestive system, but also personality traits, repressed material from traumatic experiences, motivations, and things that are just too challenging to hold in conscious awareness because of the fear or anxiety around that. This unconscious also contains, there's your personal unconscious, which is like the things that I just described, like painful memories, the subconscious, for things that you've forgotten about. And then there's the collective unconscious. This was something that Jung theorized about. This is archetypes. These are universal patterns and figures like the great mother, the hero, the trickster, the wise woman or man, the divine child. You've likely heard of archetypes. these belong to the collective unconscious. They are inherited blueprints that this is like the blueprint that helps a child know instinctively how to suckle at birth, to breastfeed, the source of instinctual drives, but also more complicated behavioral patterns beyond that. Mythological and religious imagery, symbolic metaphor, things like that tend to come from the collective unconscious. There's also the concept of the anima or the animus, which is the contrasexual aspect of the psyche. For a man, this is the inner feminine, or for a woman, this is the inner masculine, and it gets a little... We'll table that whole topic for probably another episode because it gets nuanced when we start talking about gender fluidity and things like that. Anyways, neurosis and complexes exist in the unconscious. A complex is like you have a God complex. You have this superiority issue, or you might have a mother complex where you have a mother wound that drives the way that you relate to mother figures in your life or the archetype of mother in your life. Other things that belong to the unconscious: somatic memory, relational and attachment patterns that were formed before language, biological regulatory systems like your breathing, your digestion, stuff like that. And then there's also the ancestral and intergenerational patterns. This is kind of like a fluidity between the collective unconscious and then your personal epigenetics. So from our perspective, we tend to take our consciousness for granted that this is the totality of who we are because it's what we're experiencing, it's what we're living in, it's what we're aware of. But there is so much more to you that lives in the unconscious, that lives outside of your awareness than is available for you to relate with. It's a lot. You're a lot more than just your awareness. So that's why the horizontal line, the threshold of awareness, sits so high up in the circle, because really the majority of the stuff that our brain is processing essentially is unconscious to us. So now we're in the space that's above the threshold of awareness. So that little space of the circle contains a small square. This is the ego. The ego is the center of conscious awareness. It's the I that you identify as yourself. It's what you mean when you say, I think, I feel, I want. It's not the whole psyche, but it's the part that kind of regulates the conscious experience and can experience itself and experience self-reflection. In spiritual communities, the ego gets put down a lot. We're always trying to tame the ego or detach from the ego. But the ego is also a necessary function of our psyche. It helps us stay grounded within our collective experience as a humanity, essentially. Without it, you would just be floating in a sea of people, unable to distinguish yourself from those around you. Ego helps you create boundaries in your understanding of what and who you are. And actually, a strong and healthy, grounded ego is very necessary for being able to successfully engage in shadow work. Without that healthy ego, it can collapse when meeting with the unconscious because the unconscious is so vast. And when you collapse under that, you tend to experience something similar to a dark night of the soul, or you can literally experience psychosis, which I'm not saying that to scare you. I want to be very clear about that because I know when I was new to all of this, to my own personal shadow work, that was a huge fear that I had all the time. I was constantly anxious around whether or not I was going to go crazy or something. But there's really honestly a very good chance that your ego is relatively stable and you don't have to worry that you have a weak ego or something. Just take it into consideration that knowing who you are is important and having a clear definition of who you are is helpful. So now I want to move deeper into this model At the very center of the circle is a dot, a point. This is what Jung would have called the self with a capital S. And the self is the unified totality of the entire psyche. It's the whole circle, essentially. And the self is it's a regulating center of the psyche. So essentially, there is a deeper awareness beyond your conscious awareness that contains the wholeness of who you are and regulates your psyche in accordance to this. And we experience that as like a conversation between our awareness and the unconscious. And this forms the foundational goal of Jungian psychoanalysis, which is to support what he called the pathway of individuation, which is pretty much the lifelong journey of becoming yourself, becoming your whole self, and integrating the unconscious with the conscious so that complexes could resolve and be transcended. So where does the shadow fit into this model? If you consider the ego as being like a light bulb in a room, right? Say your whole psyche is a house, and the ego is one room that is lit up in the house. That's your conscious awareness, and the light bulb itself is that ego. Every light casts a shadow, and the shadow lives in the unconscious, and it is everything that the ego does not identify with. That's the simplest way to describe it. A lot of people think the shadow is all your negative traits, it's all the dark, repulsive nature, violent ideations and things like that, darkness. The shadow is just everything that the ego cannot and will not identify with. It's a defense thing because the ego craves a very stable, defined self-concept. And so if you really identify with being very good, you're a very good person, everything that is then bad cannot reconcile with your ego identity. And so every instinct, impulse, or drive that you may experience that gets categorized as bad gets repressed into the unconscious. And this is important because people who are engaging in this, it's automatic, by the way. You don't control this process. But when you're engaging in it, it's like a self-preservation thing, and it becomes very critical and important to your sense of security to be unaware of the fact that those drives and aspects and traits exist within you but are being suppressed or regulated. The development of the shadow starts essentially from when we're born, and it's an ongoing process that exists throughout our whole lifespan. It's a necessary process. So if you've ever been around a toddler, they are pure instinct, unregulated, total, just every impulse is followed. And sometimes those impulses are really negative. They have an impulse to scream, push, bite, get violent when they're frustrated or upset. It's through interaction with the people in their environment, their caretakers, or their friends that they may hurt accidentally. It's through those interactions that they learn things like, oh, hitting and biting is bad. Getting angry and lashing out at people is bad. And I want to be good, so I'm going to regulate these impulses and kind of just shut them out of my conscious awareness. This also can be impacted by experiences around things that aren't so clearly black and white, good and bad. It can also be like you drew a really nice picture when you were a kid and somebody told you it looked like crap and that art is terrible and it's a waste of time, and you really respected this person's opinion. It might have been a teacher or a grandparent, And so suddenly your psyche is, oh, okay, we shouldn't make art. And so creative impulses can become relegated to the shadow. Expressing your emotions, crying and being vulnerable, that's a really common one that gets put into the shadow. Oh, you shouldn't be jealous, or don't covet what you don't want. Suddenly desire becomes something that gets put in the shadow. So it's not just things like wanting to harm people or getting really upset and angry. It's all kinds of stuff that gets put in the shadow. That's why the definition isn't all this dark crap about humanity, although that's what people tend to focus on when the topic is shadow. It's really just everything that is not compatible with the ego's self-concept in relationship to the goal of securing healthy attachment in a community, essentially. The ego kind of exists to help mediate the persona that we adopt within our community that keeps us safe and acceptable to our community. The great important work later on in life is to be able to kind of shed those layers and come back into authenticity. This is where shadow work becomes a part of that important journey. So essentially, the takeaways from this section is that your psyche is so much more than just what you're consciously aware of. And the shadow is developed as a protective measure for your self-development and your ability to integrate into the community that you're born into. And there's a lot of reasons why we need to do that. When we're minors, we're defenseless. We depend on our caretakers to keep us safe and to provide for us. So it's really important to be able to conform to their expectations and make ourselves likable to them. It's also important for just being able to learn how to get along with people, like in school, and learning that if someone makes you upset, you don't just walk up and punch them or something like that. Or that just because you want somebody's bracelet because it's shiny, that you can't just take it from them, that there are rules to the way that we engage with people. Also, it's important because, again, if we identified with everything, if we accepted every single thing about our interior life, our impulses and instincts as something to be identified with, there's nothing. It's if you identify with everything, then you're nothing at the same time. So having this differentiation of this is what I am and this is what I'm not is important for being able to develop a stable identity within a communal species like human beings are. So with that being said, the idea between Jungian psychology and repression and all that is that you can repress these shadow traits about yourself, but they will at some point demand recognition. And there's like a shadow archetype, right? And archetypes have this autonomous kind of existence within our psyche. This is so much more apparent when you think about parts work. Most people find it very intuitive to think about yourself as a plurality of parts. There's this part of me that really wants to lash out, but I don't think I really want to do that. Or there's this part of me that just gets so sad about this thing that happened, but I don't. There's parts to us. And these parts have autonomous lives within us. And the shadow is the same way. And the shadow has its own motivations, its own agenda, essentially, around how it wants to be recognized within your identity. And so what happens is this phenomenon that we call projection. Projection is the way by which the unconscious makes itself known to us, the ego. It is an automatic process. It's something we have no control over, but we can gain awareness of when we're projecting something onto someone. Now, a lot of times these days, projection gets used in the context of understanding conflict, especially dealing with narcissists and abuse. But projection is an everyday thing. Like when you fall in love and you feel yourself become enamored with somebody, that's a projection. It's called romantic projection. And essentially, you have this internalized ideal vision of a romantic partner. And when somebody has a trait or two that just mirrors that or frames it in a certain way, we call that person a container for your projection. And essentially, a container invites itself to be filled with your psychic projection. It's this whole relational dynamic. Oftentimes, the person who's receiving the projection, especially in the context of shadow projection, it can be a really uncomfortable experience. It can involve a lot of reactivity or unfair, just lashing out. Like when you meet someone and for just whatever reason, you just really do not like them, sometimes there's a shadow projection going on. And that might unconsciously drive your behavior to be very critical, very negative towards that person, when really they're just showing you traits or behaviors within yourself that you feel that way towards within you that you've repressed. One example might be, I'll just share one of my personal ones. I used to be super jealous of my friend because she had so many plants, right? And she's studying botany and stuff like that. Oh, I don't know if I've told her this, but now she's going to listen and she's totally going to know I'm talking about her. But yeah, I used to be really jealous of you and all your plants and stuff. I wanted plants. I wanted to be a cool little nature lady. And one day it just kind of dawned on me that for some reason I wasn't, like, for some reason inside, I had decided that I didn't have permission to own plants and that I didn't, oh, you're not smart. You don't know how to take care of plants. You don't know you don't know how to do it. You don't have the knowledge that you need to be successful at it. And I realized that and I was like, wait a second, that's just stupid. I can just go learn how to take care of plants. And I started buying house plants and now I have my own little collection of house plants and they make me very happy. And all of that negative like jealousy that I would feel towards her disappeared. That's a more mundane example of shadow projection. But sometimes there's also, oh, you were the type of person that grew up super hyper responsible. I was this person, by the way. And you have friends that are whimsical or they're not as rigid as you are. Maybe they show up late for things or they're a little more flexible or what you would consider flaky with plans. Nowadays, I consider it flexible, but back in the day, I used to get really pissed when people changed plans on me. The animosity that I felt towards people who are just like, oh, those kind of people, they're just so annoying. They don't care about how other people's time is being affected by their recklessness and poor planning. They're not respecting my time. That was a shadow projection. That was because within myself, I had repressed the freedom to be flexible, right? I grew up in an environment where that wasn't allowed. I had to be hyper responsible and it became like a very core part of my self-concept. And giving myself the permission to be more flexible, to be less rigid, to be more laid back, to not hold so much responsibility, that was an act of shadow work. That was establishing a conscious relationship with those repressed traits of flexibility, easygoingness, and integrating them into my psyche and learning how to embody those traits in a way that didn't compromise my ego identity, but actually expanded it and established greater trust within my conscious awareness between that and my desire for rest and fun and freedom and stuff like that. Politics is probably another really clear example of where shadow projection is on full display all the time. And that's in like the deep polarization of our politics in the United States, where you're so polarized, you're so hard left or so hard right that you view the other side as an other. You can't even humanize them anymore. this is like a shadow projection dynamic. So I think I've hopefully given a pretty good comprehensive overview of what shadow is and how it shows up in projection. And so then it goes on to what is shadow work. Shadow work is the work of establishing a conscious relationship with your shadow, not to get rid of it, not to control it, but to just understand it. It's a relationship that you're developing. And when you develop that conscious relationship with the shadow, you're able to gain awareness of when it's showing up in your life unconsciously, right? You can notice, oh, I think this might be a little bit of projection going on, or, oh, I think this uncomfortable feeling is rooted in a shadow construct. And by doing that, by establishing that relationship, you're able to mediate its impulses better rather than be controlled by them through projection and reactivity. So now that we're really finally onto the shadow work piece of this, I want to kind of clarify. I want to circle back to the social media presentation of shadow work versus what shadow work actually is in its traditional context. So the social media, the spiritual community trend of shadow work tends to look like you get your shadow work journal. There are these aesthetic journaling prompts for your shadow self, and they're more like self-reflection exercise than actual depth work. How do you know the difference? Obviously, self-reflection is really helpful, but the whole core that we need to understand about the shadow is that it's unconscious to us. So if you're just sitting there journaling, like, you know, you're a control freak or something like that. And so you're just journaling over and over, articulating to yourself the shape and identity of your control freak tendencies. That's not necessarily shadow work, because that's stuff that's already perfectly within your conscious awareness. It's part of your self-concept. Shadow work aims to uncover the things that are outside of our awareness that we don't want to look at, that we're not comfortable looking at. With that being said, I don't want you to think that shadow work only focuses on things that are uncomfortable, or that you have to feel uncomfortable in order to be doing shadow work. That's not what I'm trying to say. But shadow work should be excavating things that were outside of your awareness. Sometimes that excavation process requires more than just me thinking about how it dawned on me one day that, oh, I can just buy plants. I've been telling myself I'm not allowed, but now I can. Those types of, I guess, revelations, I guess I would say there's like levels of shadow work. There's like really deep shadow work that goes very deep into very deeply vulnerable places where you might feel, when you're more vulnerable, the threat to being dysregulated or triggered or feeling uncomfortable is much higher. But then there's kind of like more shallow or mundane levels to shadow work, where it's just like you have a random revelation. And part of this goes back to the self as the central regulating force of the psyche. It's very incredible what the self chooses to reveal to the ego, and when it has decided that the ego is ready to receive these things. And so I always place great trust in my own psyche to reveal itself to me as I am ready to be revealed to, that I'm never going to be shown things that are beyond my capacity to handle. That being said, you can end up going much further than what you're prepared for. People sometimes get into shadow work and they're like trying to force things to happen, and you shouldn't do that. I think sometimes this comes back to how it's portrayed in social media. Is shadow work is this huge buzzword. The intensity of it is really engaging for people. It's what gets views. Or sometimes it gets conflated with trauma processing or catharsis, or it becomes gamified, like a 30-day shadow work program, things like that. It's being used as a marketing hook rather than being explored in a way that honors the tradition out of which it came from. And so a lot of important context gets drowned out from the conversation. It becomes something where it's like, I've had so many customers come to me asking about shadow work, and they're scared of it because the way it's portrayed on social media is kind of so oogie boogie, or they just like their concept of it is shallow. They don't really understand what exactly shadow work is meant to accomplish. They think it's just, oh, it's just going to make you feel better or something like that. Or like it's just a part of your self-care routine. Like you do your little journal prompts and then, oh, yay, I did my shadow work. That's just it's a very consumerized version of shadow work. And it's created a lot of misconceptions. So I want to take a look at some of those common misconceptions now. One of those common misconceptions we've already kind of talked about is like people think that the shadow is only negative or only scary stuff. But the shadow contains everything that the ego does not identify with. This can be creativity. It can be being open and warm and friendly with people. It can be about being vulnerable with others, sharing or being affectionate with the people around you. It could be about courage. Being brave can be something that's part of the shadow. We call this the gold that's hidden in the shadow. One of the rewards of doing shadow work is uncovering the gold that's contained in the shadow that helps expand your self-concept in a way that's so satisfying and fulfilling. Like you might not have even realized that there was an artist hidden within you, or a dancer or a singer, and reaching that piece of your identity and pulling it out of the unconscious and kind of establishing a relationship with it can bring so much fulfillment and expansion into your world. But that isn't to say that it's also all that either. If you have lived through trauma or had really scary experiences in life, there's stuff that's going to be there in the shadow that can be really overwhelming to approach. The key point is that the shadow isn't just negative. It's also not just positive. It's everything that the ego does not identify with. Another huge misconception about shadow work is that people come into it thinking that the shadow is something you have to get rid of or defeat, right? That people think about the two wolves that live within you, and there's the good wolf and the bad wolf, and whichever wolf wins is the one that you feed. That's not shadow work. That is not the Jungian shadow. That is not what's happening. The shadow is an aspect of yourself that with shadow work, we are attempting to establish a conscious relationship with, so that when shadow shows up in your life, you're able to recognize it and say hello, basically, and reach out and be like, hey, what's going on here? What do you need from me in this moment? Rather than shadow being like, oh, ego doesn't care about me, I'm just going to do whatever I want. And then suddenly you're like caught in some crazy projection that leads to a ton of conflict and grievance in your life. Another huge misconception is there are people that think they don't have a shadow because they are either super spiritual, so they think they're enlightened, or they think they don't have a shadow because they never lived through severe trauma. Everybody has a shadow. As we said before, the shadow is not about repressing negativity. It's about defining your self-concept. You can't go through life without having a shadow because you can't identify with everything. That would mean that you identify with none of it. And so in order to define yourself as a person, you have to decide that there are some things that I'm not, right? If you're going to say I am this, you're also going to have to say I'm not that. And so that is the process of creating the shadow. Another misconception about shadow work is that if you have a strong emotional reaction to something going on in your life, that always means there's shadow work to do. And that's a decent rule of thumb to follow. But also, once I would say, probably if you're on the really start of your shadow work journey, that's a really good rule of thumb to follow. But after a certain point, you reach an area in your development where just because you're having a strong emotional reaction doesn't mean there's a shadow projection at play. Sometimes the things that you're experiencing completely justify a strong emotional reaction. And I wish I could differentiate this for you, because I've gotten this, like I said, this is my bread and butter, and I feel it. I feel the very distinct difference between when I'm having a strong emotional reaction that is a component of a projection dynamic with the shadow, versus when I'm having a strong emotional reaction that is completely appropriate and normal and expected of the situation that I'm experiencing. It's a very unique and specific sensation almost. It feels magnetic, right? It feels like you're being forced into seeing something a certain way, or like you're losing access to your mediating faculties that can hold awareness for how you're going to engage with a certain situation that's triggering stuff for you. I'll have to think on that, because I think that would be really helpful to be able to articulate that to people. One of the other big misconceptions is that shadow work is inherently painful, and if you don't feel super crappy while doing it, then you're doing it wrong. And I think that this is a kind of a nuanced thing. Shadow work should take you places that bring you information that was totally unknown to you before about yourself. And it feels different. Like when you're having that type of integrative revelation, it feels different. It's like a suddenly, oh my gosh, I hadn't even thought of that or considered that yet. That's the type of thing you're looking for with shadow work. And there are lots of times where that experience is accompanied by discomfort. But there's also a lot of times where that type of revelation is just completely mundane, like my flower and houseplants thing that I was talking about. And sometimes the revelation that's coming is actually liberating. It's not like a shock or finding out something distressing about yourself that you have to learn how to metabolize. Sometimes it's a liberation that you realize something about yourself, where it's like, oh gosh, I had been holding this really heavy burden this whole time, and now I'm understanding where that comes from and how it's related to something that I was repressing about myself. And now that I'm aware of this, I'm freed from this burden. So there's two different flavors that shadow work progress can really come in, and it really just depends on the specific material that you're working with within the shadow. Learning that you repressed your artistic abilities your whole life can be accompanied by a lot of grief, but also through a lot of joy once you realize that, oh, I can actually pursue these desires. I'm totally free to, and by doing that, I'm increasing the joy in my life. But it's also likely that doing something like that is going to be accompanied by some grief for the experiences that you had that led to that repression in the first place. And then the other thing is that there's no finished state with shadow work. You as a person are constantly evolving. The communities that you belong to are evolving. The roles that you take on in your life are always evolving. And so the ideas that you pick up about what you're supposed to be and who you are, that's always changing and adapting to the evolving landscape and environment that you experience over the course of your entire lifespan. And so the shadow is always being added to, it's always being developed. So there's no end to it. It's just The practice of having that conscious relationship with shadow is a lifelong skill that you're developing and bringing into your habitual being. Also, shadow work is not a vehicle for self punishment or self criticism or shaming yourself. That's what drives the shadow in the first place. Yeah, like the goal isn't to find the darkness within you so that you can feel gross about it or be ashamed of it. It's to develop understanding and empathy for those things within you and how they come to exist. And by doing so, you're actually able to better empathize with other people who maybe struggled to mediate those impulses. And being able to have that understanding takes a lot of the emotional enchantment, I guess I would say, out of the thing, right? It reduces the reactivity of triggers in your life in a way. With that being said, I want to talk about some safety measures with doing shadow work because it does tend to run parallel or directly cross over and overlap with trauma processing and doing some really deep healing work or achieving catharsis in your life for repressed memories. There's a relationship there, but they're not strictly all the same thing. I really want people to understand this is the biggest thing that I encounter with people in different online communities, the people that come see me for readings, is a lot of people think that they need an intense emotional catharsis to do their shadow work. And a lot of the times, seeking that out is actually a recipe for re traumatization. Or I explain to people that it's sometimes when you're in the beginning of your self development journey, you think you encounter shadow work and you really want to do it because you see somebody who is further ahead on the journey and you really want to be like them. So you just are like, okay, I'm going to force this and make it work. I'm going to make myself face these things. That's like, though, you shouldn't do that. Just don't do that, please. There's a whole reason why there's a reason why it's being kept out of your awareness. The self is it's compassionate towards you. It's your whole self and it understands you better than anybody because it is you. It's the whole you. And it's mediating what gets allowed into that awareness and everything based on what you're ready to receive. And that isn't to say that you can't force yourself to go further than what you're really prepared for. And so you need to be aware if you have had traumatic experiences in your life that doing shadow work is not something that you force. You have to be aware of this concept of the threshold of tolerance because if you have a trauma history, then your nervous system is predisposed to being dysregulated. And especially if that trauma is unresolved, you haven't worked with a therapist to properly process that trauma, it's stuck in your nervous system. And getting really triggered it just creates more trauma, which is counterintuitive to the whole shadow work thing. So the best way to identify your limits with this work is to learn to cultivate a good awareness of how you feel in your body when you are processing emotional content and doing your shadow work. Now, this is going to be really challenging because if you're starting from where I started from and you have no bodily awareness because you're just in a dissociated state all the time, I'm going to give a huge yellow flag warning caution about proceeding with shadow work because if you're in that state, and most people that I meet that I can intuitively pick up that they're there in that stage, they readily acknowledge that they live in dissociation all the time. So I feel like the people who need to hear this, you already know that you're dissociated all the time. You already are aware that you struggle to identify your emotions and that you kind of live in a numb state or you're just constantly on autopilot. You're already aware of that. Big yellow flag caution. Go to a therapist first before you start doing shadow work. You need to work with a really good therapist to bring your nervous system into a stable baseline, essentially, where you can actually tolerate uncomfortable emotions. Because if your default state is dissociated, it means that you are so armored up psychologically that any type of emotion is really triggering for you and sends your nervous system into a dysregulated state. And trying to do all this shadow work stuff on your own is going to run a really big risk of one, re-traumatizing you, and two, making you have to go through some of the things I went through, which really aren't necessary. I'm talking about dark night of the soul, panic attacks, having to spend the whole night in a tub soothing yourself because you remembered something that was like way too intense for you to handle at that time. And this other aspect is, I know that you probably have tried talking to therapists and it's not been that effective. You need to be researching the type of therapeutic modalities that your therapists engage with. And I'm going to just rattle off some really decent ones that chances are, if you find a therapist that advertises being specialized in these things, that they're going to be working from a framework that can help you go deeper in your therapy, so that you don't feel like you're just doing talk therapy and just talking random crap that never actually goes anywhere therapeutic. Attachment-based therapists, internal family systems is a good one. Therapists that offer hypnotherapy, they're automatically working from a framework of going into the unconscious and kind of excavating that. Therapists that use mindfulness-based approaches, somatic experiencing or Gestalt, psychodynamic therapy, narrative therapy, existential therapy as well. Oh, and also trauma-informed therapists. Obviously, that's like the go-to one if you know you have trauma. Just want to be clear, I am making these recommendations based on my personal experience of working with different therapists and not as medical advice. So if you are browsing for therapists and you find some therapists that advertise those modalities, there's a decent chance that they could be a decent fit for you because they are working with frameworks that are specifically designed for going deeper into therapy. So if you're one of these people that I'm describing as like perpetually dissociated and you struggle with anxiety and stuff like that, please work with a therapist to get yourself to a stable baseline and then go from there and start doing shadow work. And then even if you don't have a serious trauma history or you don't struggle a lot with nervousness and reactivity, it's still a good idea. Like, shadow work is something that developed in a therapeutic context. Carl Jung was a psychiatrist developing a therapy and training psychoanalysts and therapists to be able to do this work. So it is a therapeutic tool, and it's helpful to be doing it in a container with somebody who can help guide you through it, that is able to establish an ongoing relationship with you built on trust and safety, who has the experience to help you analyze and understand the content that can come up when doing shadow work. And really just the biggest thing is just to never try and force a shadow encounter, never try and force intensity. I knew somebody who felt like they had to crack themselves open and become like just a sobbing fit on the floor in order to achieve progression. And it really doesn't have to be that way. You can titrate your emotional experience with shadow work. And I really advise people to do it that way. It's a marathon, not a race. You don't have to figure out shadow work in a whole season or a year. It's meant to be a lifelong habit. You're learning a skill for how to relate to yourself and how to understand the things that you experience in your interior world. Essentially, you're learning a new way of being. That is what shadow work is for. It's not like physical therapy, which you're also not supposed to rush if you have an injury and you're in physical therapy. But it's not like a short-term thing or a time-contained thing. It's a lifelong habit that you're building. With that being said, this is what shadow work is. I'm about to say, what is shadow work? It's noticing projection, which is a learned habit. This is where journaling is helpful because you can journal about an experience you're having with somebody, and projection is always relational. It always involves another person. If you're having a really big conflict with somebody, or you're noticing feelings of admiration, like, I want to be them, I want to be them, that kind of feeling. So noticing projection when you have a really strong reaction to someone else, whether positive or negative, asking yourself what that intensity is telling you about yourself. What you can't stand in others often is what you can't stand in yourself, and what you idealize in others is often what you haven't claimed in yourself. Dream work is another big aspect of shadow work. The unconscious speaks directly in dream imagery. The language of the unconscious is symbolic. Recurring dreams, figures that disturb or fascinate, situations that repeat, these are worth investigating, and that can be its own episode. Dream work is a really big one that I've spent a lot of years honing in my life. But I can recommend the Temenos app. It's a dream interpretation app. It does use AI, but you don't have to use AI. It's an optional thing within that app, and it's completely self-developed. And the developers have a really strong policy around privacy. Everything you send over is encrypted and stuff like that, because they recognize that dreams are incredibly private and can be incredibly vulnerable. So that's an app that I like. It doesn't function like a dream dictionary. Don't use those for dream work. That's not dream work. But the app guides you through these steps of analyzing your own dream and working with your own associations with dreams, and can help you understand what your dream is trying to tell you. I like it just as giving it structure for the dream work, because otherwise, I have too many dreams to just keep track of them all the time. I wait for one that feels really emotionally charged, and then I often will write it out, but then I never analyze it because I have ADHD, and I don't have the executive capacity to think through all the steps that I need to do to break it down, to identify symbols and then come up with my list of associations with them. The Temenos app just walks you through that, and so it's a really great facilitator of dream work. Tracking your emotions and noticing recurring triggers and just getting curious about it. A big one of shadow work is learning to sit with discomfort rather than immediately resolving it. Just being able to sit in existence with uncomfortable sensations and feelings. We really try and run away from our feelings all the time. We distract ourselves from our feelings, scrolling on phones or eating junk food, things like that. And learning to sit and stay present with that discomfort is a very important skill. And it gets back to what we were talking about earlier with the trauma and the dysregulation. If you're constantly in a dissociated state, or you're always experiencing aversion to feeling things, or you are the person that tends to escape from emotions by keeping busy or something like that, you might want to work with a therapist to learn those skills to be able to stay present with your emotions. But if you're kind of like further along, developing a mindfulness meditation practice can be really helpful. Yoga is really helpful for that. Just whatever you can do to stay present with a sensation without having to think about it or resolve it, just letting it exist in your body and feeling it to completion, that's really important stuff for shadow work. Another big piece of shadow work is noticing how you show up in relationships with others. What are you repressing or suppressing? What are you performing in relationships that just comes automatically to you and is not quite reflective of how you really feel in a relationship? That's great material for shadow work. Creative expression, journaling, I think I consider it a form of creative expression, but it's a creative expression that's not meant to be shared. You're just writing stream of consciousness. And once you get in that flow state, there's some really surprising stuff that can come up in a journaling session that is shadow work, that is bringing revelation into your awareness about who you are and what you've repressed. Yeah, art, painting, just see what flows out of you. When you're in that flow state, it's like the ego has kind of stepped aside. And actually, this relates to different brainwave states that I've been learning about with Body Mind Bridge. When you're in a flow state of creativity, you've gotten out of your beta mind awareness, which is like the thinking mind, the ego mind, and you go more into an alpha state where you're kind of just like a calm awareness, and unconscious material flows more easily into your awareness when you're in that state. So creativity is a great vehicle for shadow work. Again, I come back to these things like, you're doing shadow work when you're doing these things, when you're going somewhere that isn't already in your awareness about yourself. Just regular self-reflection, it's very confirmatory. It's affirming the things that you already know, whereas shadow work takes you somewhere that you were resisting the whole time. It's about gaining new awareness about things that were being repressed within you. That's how you know it's shadow work and not just regular run-of-the-mill self-reflection. Often the results of shadow work can look very mundane because it's just, again, it's learning how to engage with content in your mind and that you're experiencing in your environment in just a different way, like a more calm, reserved way, a more observing way rather than a reacting way. The goal with shadow work is integration, not just mainly awareness. Being able to name a wound or being able to articulate an experience or have catharsis is not the end of shadow work. It's the integration that is the goal. Integration is being able to notice a pattern in real time when you're acting it out with a person, and being able to hit that pause button and mediate your impulses within yourself and be like, oh, here's that projection showing up again. Do I want to take this action or do I want to take another action? Do I need to check in with my inner child or something, or the piece of myself that resists feeling some type of way, and kind of like self-soothe a little bit? Other signs that shadow work is working is that you can sit with ambiguity or like the grayness of life rather than the black and white, like good and bad. You can sit more in that liminal ambiguity without being triggered into shame or defensiveness. You have more space to hold complexity. Other signs it's working: the energy that was bound up in suppressing shadow aspects becomes free and available to be used for life. It's exhausting being in a suppressed state. Your mental resources are being used to keep that suppressed, and it consumes calories. It's an energy expenditure. Physiologically, energy is being expended to keep things repressed. Once you release that and are able to get to a place where you can just be okay with it and kind of hold it in awareness without getting triggered or dysregulated, that frees up a ton of energy for you to be able to engage with life. Relationships could improve in your life with shadow work because you reclaim your projections. You're able to see people as they are rather than interacting with the projection that they're holding for you. Usually relationships improve from that, but sometimes this is a nuanced dynamic, but sometimes the person receiving the projection is really comfortable in that dynamic, and by reclaiming your projection, you've actually placed that person in an uncomfortable position and they might withdraw from the relationship because they themselves are not ready for authentic relating. But that's another topic for another day. I think that's a pretty good overview of shadow work. Yeah, that was a nice episode. I enjoyed this. I'm still getting used to the podcasting and being confident in my voice, but this is a subject matter that I feel very confident in, and I'm happy that I got to share it with everybody today. I'm going to wrap it up here. And next episode, now that I have laid down what shadow work is and everything, I want to talk about shadow workers and light workers in spiritual professions and what they are for, how they differentiate from each other, because I know light worker is a big one, but shadow worker is kind of starting to emerge because it's not very smart marketing to call yourself a shadow worker because of a lot of the misconceptions that I laid out earlier about shadow work. A lot of people avoid it or think it's really scary. It's important to talk about the different modalities because there's a place for each one for light work and shadow work, and they interact and they are important with each other. So that's going to be the next episode, and I can't wait to see you then. Take care. Thank you for listening to Moon Lodge Mingle. If you found this valuable, please consider sharing it with a friend who might need it. You can find more content through my blog and newsletter at moonlodgemystic.com. If you're interested in a tarot or Vedic astrology reading, or you'd like to work one-on-one in a personalized cacao journey, you can book through my website. Until next time, take care.